So as everyone knows, the theme of the day today is environmental philanthropy. And so we were really very pleased to be able to have that kicked off with the discussion with Devika Shah of the Environment Funders Canada, as well as Dana Decent. I hope I'm saying that properly, Dana, Community Foundations of Canada. So Brady mentioned we have another speaker from Community Foundations of Canada today, but my understanding is, Dana, you really focus on some of the environmental giving aspects within your organization. So great that you can join us for this kickoff conversation. Both Devika and Dana can give us a bit of a national view before we dive more deeply into the regional situation. They're both fresh out of their own national meetings, I understand, which gives us a really great opportunity to gain some insights for our region from these national discussions that are very, very fresh. It's my understanding that both organizations are also interested in furthering their relationships within Atlantic Canada. So that's really in line with the spirit of this event, which is about sharing information, but also forging relationships and future directions for the sector. So with that, I'll turn it over to Devika to get the discussion started, and then Dana will respond, but I know that they're both really hoping that you'll have some questions and comments to add as well after they get things going for us. So turn it over to you, Devika.
Thanks, and hello everybody. It's really nice to virtually be with you, though I wish I could physically be in Atlantic Canada right now by the ocean. That would be a lot better. I thought maybe perhaps it's helpful for everyone if perhaps I can tell you a little bit about Environment Funders Canada and turn it over to Dana to tell you a little bit about Community Foundations Canada, just in terms of what our organizations do. And then I'll jump into the comments I was going to deliver, just so people have a bit of context. So I'll start. I'll just say, Environment Funders Canada, our mission is to strengthen the impact of philanthropy in support of an environmentally sound and sustainable future for Canada. And our members, we were formerly called the Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Network. Our members are a national network of philanthropic foundations and other organizations that fund in the environmental space. We have just over 70 members. The majority of them are charitable foundations, but there are some government and corporate members as well. I'd say the majority of our members are Canadian, but about 10 to 12 of them are American foundations that grant in Canada. Only 2 of our members are from Atlantic Canada. One is a very new foundation, and the other is the government of New Brunswick. I'd say our members primarily fund conservation work, climate action, nature connection, and toxics and waste reduction. And we have sort of 3 pillars of work that we do. One is about sharing skills and knowledge and best practice amongst our members. The other is catalyzing collaboration, so helping groups of funders to do better work together and more of a collective impact model. And then the third is just growing the pie. We need more money in environment directed towards environmental initiatives than we currently have. So there are a bunch of national funder networks out there, but there are 4 in particular. Ours is one, and Dana's is the other, Community Foundations of Canada. There's also Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, and then there's also the Circle, which I know somebody just put a link to their upcoming conference. But generally, all of us, I'd say, have a similar way of working with our members in that, we're always exchanging information with them, putting forward professional development opportunities, best practices, like webinars and things that people can learn from, and offering all kinds of networking so members can talk to each other. We use our conference, which is our annual, I'd say all of us have a big annual conference, and that's why Dana and I are just coming out of ours and can speak to that. But we use our conference and webinars and workshops to help our members increase their impact. And we also host 2 funder collaboratives. And this is funders coming together, pooling their funding and granting collectively. And right now we're about to head into strategic planning. So we're looking at if and how our role needs to change. And I'd say the thing that we're wrestling with quite a bit is venue or voice. Do we do one or both? Offer the venue for everyone to just come together, or do we actually take a position on a few things with a voice? And it's something that the organization, I think, will be sorting out in the next few months. And I've been in the role of ED for 5 months now, so it's still pretty new for me, but I think several of my previous roles kind of tied together into this role. So I actually started my career as a professional fundraising, but through my work with the Catherine Donnelly Foundation board, I've also been on the granting side. I've worked for a major climate and energy policy think tank, which is the Pembina Institute. I've also worked for a major conservation organization, which is WWF Canada, and most recently served as Executive Director of Social Planning Toronto, which has nothing to do with environmental work, though it should, but it has a social justice, equity, poverty reduction, civic engagement mandate. So that's my intro. I'll just pass it over to Dana to just say hello and tell us a little bit about Community Foundations of Canada, who your membership is and what your focus is.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I get so inspired every time I hear you talk. So thank you for joining us here today. I'm so excited to be here with you virtually. I'll share a little bit about myself as well, and then a little bit more about Community Foundations of Canada. So my name is Dana Decent, Decent pronounced exactly like the adjective. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a cis queer woman here living in Mi'kma'ki in Nova Scotia. And my background is in sustainability and climate change, working for a variety of different sectors, corporate, nonprofit, academic, and now I lead partnerships at Community Foundations of Canada. So as Devika mentioned, Community Foundations of Canada is a philanthropic network of Canada's 191 community foundations. So many of you here on this call would be familiar with that term, but for those who aren't, a community foundation is a public foundation that anyone can donate to, and they use the interest from their endowments to grant to local projects in their community. So we have really large ones like the Vancouver Foundation or the Toronto's, and then we have really small ones. Manitoba has 50 community foundations, many of them rural. So we have a really wide membership base, all doing good work in their community and serving their community. So CFC, as a national organization, we have the purpose to relentlessly pursue a future where everyone belongs. Our values are strengthening community, shifting power, and taking the long view. And then we do this in a variety of different ways. We have an excellent learning institute. My colleague Cindy Lindsay is on the call as co-director there to really boost up and accelerate the impact of capabilities of community foundations. We have a variety of different programs. We have one right now on gender equality that's really impactful. And then in my work in partnerships, you know, I have connections and work with a wide range of different folks across Canada and even internationally to figure out how can we work together to accelerate impact here in the country. So we're really about bringing folks together. Back to what you said about a venue and voice, I think we do a little bit of both. We just had a venue of a massive online conference and brought folks from across Canada together as well as internationally. We had community foundations from Bermuda and Puerto Rico and Romania and Northern Ireland. So it was quite a mixed group of people and all discovering together.
Great. Thank you, Dana. And I'm so glad you were able to join for this conversation because you've also just moved to Halifax, and so even better. So I wanted to just kind of focus my comments on two things. One is, I'm not sure if you've seen this or not, but there was a report that my organization, which at the time was called Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Network, commissioned. Jamie Gamble did the work. A lot of you probably know Jamie. But Jamie was commissioned to deliver this report for us in 2015 on philanthropy, the philanthropic landscape in Atlantic Canada back then. And then I'm going to fast forward to our conference, which just happened, to kind of share some of the trends that came out of that conference, at least from my perspective. So it's kind of like a 2015 in Atlantic Canada specifically, fast forward to 2021, what's going on in philanthropy nationally and environmental philanthropy specifically. So I won't spend too long on the report. I'll just share, obviously I wasn't at the organization when this was done, so I read the report just like anyone else. But the things that jumped out for me, one is that the reason the organization commissioned the report back in 2015 is based on the fact that the 2011 to 2013 data was showing that environmental philanthropy was only about 2% of it was being directed to Atlantic Canada. And nationally, there's such a small percentage of philanthropy that goes to the environment to begin with. And then from that very small percentage, only 2% of it is being directed to Atlantic Canada. So Jamie conducted interviews with 40 representatives. They were environmental grant makers, philanthropists, a few environmental NGOs, and also some of our members that were interested in granting in the region. I don't currently have the updated data to know what percentage Atlantic Canada is now receiving 6 years later, but perhaps other people do. Oh, thank you for the link, Kelly. But the findings that jumped out at me, so, private foundations in Atlantic Canada, about half of them have made large grants primarily to land conservation and wildlife protection as of 2015. The community foundations had very little environmental activity going on. The corporate actors were basically doing things that, like everywhere, were aligned with their corporate social responsibility mandates, and it was like employee-driven activities like shoreline cleanups. And then the members of our organization outside of Atlantic Canada that do make grants in the region were primarily, again, funding land stewardship activities. And in all of those cases, their funding patterns were firmly established, meaning that they didn't have a lot of room to accept new applications. So it's more about growing the pie. I think some of the challenges are limited wealth and visibility in Atlantic Canada, philanthropic wealth, that is. One interesting challenge that jumped out at me is that actually, there's a local issue focus, which isn't a challenge, it's a strength, in that grassroots engagement in environmental issues is very high at the local level. And actually, Atlantic Canadians contribute a great portion of their volunteer time to the environmental movement. But because these efforts are so place-based, so highly localized, as a result, they're often independent and isolated. So the connection between those bigger, either provincial or regional or even national issues and the grassroots work was hard to make. So it felt fragmented. And yeah, the funders in Atlantic Canada place a lot of their resources in the land stewardship side, tend to avoid working on environmental work that is more controversial, whereas a lot of the CEGN members, when I say CEGN, I mean current organization EFC, located outside of Atlantic Canada, were interested in funding some of the policy change work and some of the things like campaigning and communications. But a lot of those campaigning messages from outside just don't resonate in Atlantic Canada. And people wanted to hear more about the links between environmental and economic sustainability. Some of the strategies are about connecting the dots. So being able to tell a cohesive story about how all of these local initiatives tie together for a bigger story for Atlantic Canada. Getting the messaging right. So more, stronger focus on economic ties, for example. Also seeking new sources. So for example, wealthy retirees who have moved to Atlantic Canada, US funders with a conservation focus, and also impact investing as a really interesting opportunity where you can kind of come at things from an intersectional way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a philanthropic investment, but still a huge investment that furthers environmental objectives. So fast forward to today, we just put on a conference called Transform 2021, Sense Making and Bubble Breaking. And the premise for this is that the Canadian approach to change and to the environmental wins that we've had so far tends to result in incremental wins and sort of slow but steady progress, everything in moderation. I don't have to explain this to other Canadians, but it's sort of a very Canadian approach. And that has served us well in many occasions. I think what we just witnessed south of the border for the past 4 years is an illustration of the times where I know I personally have appreciated that Canadian moderation and taking things a bit slower. But for the environmental challenges that we face, we have less than a decade to turn things around. We have literally less than a decade, both to engineer a green recovery and to sort of build a whole new low carbon economy, less than a decade to turn things around with respect to conservation and achieving the targets that we have, and to kind of embed social justice and equity in the way that we do that. And it's it's a daunting challenge. Like, the emissions reductions that we had in 2020 because of COVID ended up being 5 to 7% of a reduction. And look at how drastically the world changed because of COVID. In order to meet our emissions targets, we need an 8% reduction every year for the next 10 years. So that just puts into context what kind of action is needed, how bold it has to be, and how rapid it has to be. And so the premise of this conference is that we have to be willing to do things very differently because the old approach isn't serving us in this next decade, specifically for environmental issues. And so the focus on bubble breaking was that the environmental sector tends to be very dismissive and in its own bubble, and not willing to intersect with what matters to people in communities, with what matters in other issues that have a huge environmental implication. And so the bubble breaking became the theme of like, how are we going to break out of the bubbles that we live in so that we can work differently? And I think the findings of that report that I just referred to back in 2015 illustrated that, right? The environmental sector, at least nationally, has been operating in a bubble that was not working for Atlantic Canada. That's an example of what I mean. And so we had 4 days, and each day was about breaking a different bubble. The first was about breaking the economics 101 bubble. So basically acknowledging that there are many ways in which our economic systems are broken. And unless we address that side of the equation, we can do all the environmental action we want, but we're working within an economic system that is hindering that progress. The second day was breaking our privilege bubble. And as everyone knows, this has become the issue of the day, but centering equity, racial equity, and other social justice issues in our work is becoming just front of mind for everybody in every sector in every way. And so our second day was breaking the privilege bubble. The third day was breaking the public opinion bubble. And that is about the fact that as an environmental movement, we really haven't found a way to reach the majority of Canadians and have them sort of convinced. Instead, it's been Greta Thunberg and Donald Trump pulling out of Paris and climate change itself and floods and all kinds of impacts that people are feeling that has contributed to the shift in public opinion that we've seen. But the traditional environmental NGOs actually haven't made a lot of progress in communicating to those audiences. What they have done is communicated to the people who, 10% of the population that already identifies as green or environmentalist. They've done a good job with that group and mobilizing them. And then the fourth day was breaking our own philanthropic barriers. So the barriers that as funders we put up that get in the way of change. A few things that jumped out. I'd say that, and I attended a little bit of the CFC conference as well. And what struck me about both of our conferences is that both were very provocative. In both cases, we put forward things that normally wouldn't be said so boldly. But people were talking about increasing the disbursement quota that foundations are granting. People were talking about getting rid of the non-qualified donee status. People were talking about working intersectionally, stop trying to convince people on our issues and meet them where they're at. And that groups led by Indigenous people and people of color are already working in those intersectional ways. And people working in local communities at that place-based level are already working in intersectional ways. Letting go of control. So for funders to admit that they don't know nearly as much as they think they do, and to place the decision-making power in the hands of communities that are at the front lines doing the work, and shifting to multi-year unrestricted funding, and evolving the role of the foundation executive from more of a command and control and bureaucracy role to one of partnership, learning, embedding within a broader change ecosystem, building trust, and doing the work of bringing their boards on side, because that is often a big barrier to real change. People were talking about things like doing away with grant applications, allow every organization, and I heard this from Vu Lee at the CFC conference, to write a business case and just submit the same thing to everyone so that they can focus on the actual work. And I had a whole bunch of takeaways from each of the days, which I will save for now, but maybe I'll just, we can work that into the discussion later on. But I will say that there was a talk about the role of NGOs and the role of philanthropy. NGOs have a really critical role to play in articulating and advocating for alternate visions that backcast from where we need to be instead of forecast from where we are today. And that philanthropy needs to be there when the business case isn't immediately obvious to the powers that be, because philanthropy, we don't have enough money in philanthropy to bring about, to directly fund the level of change that's required. But what we can do is leverage the little sliver of money that we do have to push for that broader systems change so that the big players like government are forced to reallocate resources in different ways because of the systems change work that we did with our, with our more limited resources. And the other big theme that came out, as I said, is that we need to, as an environmental movement, we need to stop trying to mobilize others around our agenda and shift to a co-design model that requires building relationships and trust and reciprocity. And it means we don't have full control over the process or the outcomes. We have to go slow in order to go fast. If we want to build a movement that actually leads to durable systems change and doesn't get done and redone every time the political pendulum swings from one government to the next, but is really reinforced as an actual cultural shift. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of takeaways is that someone said on the Public Opinion Day that policy lives downstream from politics and politics lives downstream from culture. So a key role for philanthropy must be focused on shifting cultural values. It's not the outcome of a single campaign, but a diversity of efforts over a long period of time. So when we organize around a single issue, we compromise on our ability to connect with people around the things that are core to their values. And so instead, we need to go to where people are rather than trying to get others to care about how they can help to achieve conservation and climate targets, which is what we care about. We need to recognize that any movements that are centering public benefit and social justice will inevitably advance environmental solutions in ways that lead to cultural shifts. So we need to listen to what other people care about and understand the interconnections between those issues and our issues and change the way we communicate and campaign. And structures in the philanthropic sector have had unintended consequences that hamper our ability to instigate those cultural shifts. So there was a lot of conversation amongst the funders about finding ways, as I said earlier, to support non-qualified donees, to employ participatory grant-making models that are driven by grassroots experts, and seeking out the people who were doing that novel grassroots engagement work rather than making them spend hours trying to find us as funders. So I will stop there. Yeah, there's a lot more to share, but I've been talking for a long time and I'm getting tired of hearing myself talk.
Amazing ideas there and lots of fodder for discussion, I'm sure. Dana, do you want to add to that or react?
I mean, snap, just echoing a lot of what you say there. I think there was a lot of synergy between the two conferences. Myself and some of my colleagues were able to attend EFC's conference for the most part. And what you said, I think, about shifting power, that was a really big piece. And that definitely applies to environmental funding. And exactly that, it's on to you as the funder to find those groups instead of making them do the work. They're already doing the work and should focus on that. We need more environmental funding, period. We'll be getting results from a survey of community foundations in the coming months. But generally, community foundations don't grant too much to the environment, which really, when you think about it, doesn't make sense because everything depends on a healthy natural environment. We can't have a fully functioning economy, can't have a fully functioning community if the environment is sick. And so that should be in tandem, like what you just said, in tandem with your other priorities. There was just a report released around the intersection of health and climate, and they're so interconnected. I think we heard a lot about mission and values and how, as grant makers, we care a lot about that. And we talk a lot about that in terms of grant making, but 97%, 95% are in investments. And often those investments then are not mission and values aligned. And when you look at the numbers, that's where the bulk of the wealth is. So needing to shift that with an environmental lens as well. And there's lots that you can do there. We heard from the foundation of Greater Montreal. The new executive director formerly worked at the David Suzuki Foundation, and so is really bringing an environmental lens to the investments held at the foundation of Greater Montreal. I think we heard a little bit about how to talk about climate change, and I was struck by how similar it is to just having any hard conversation. We had a session where folks literally, they lead workshops around how to talk about climate change, but really it's just how to have tough conversations. Some of the same principles apply to talks about racism or diversity or talking to your board that is not moving forward with the direction you want to go. We have to be confident. We have to lead with love and empathy. We have to be clear, and we have to look beyond our bubbles. So I think there was so much synergy that was between the two conferences, and a lot of the key messages and framing.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to add to the conversation or ask Devika or Dana? I love the idea of, well, a lot of the ideas, but that sort of the shifting of power and the bottom up, and also and certainly the point about relating to Atlantic Canadians in terms of the point that came out about economic well-being and the intersection between economy and the environment, which, that recognition has been there since the 80s when we started talking about sustainable development, but it's still so real. And that's one of the things that I first heard when I came to the province as well. People's livelihoods are so interconnected with their environment, and we have to be thinking about those intersections between economic livelihoods and environmental conservation. And so it was great to hear those perspectives. And also the point about the business plan model. I'd love to hear more about that idea of just presenting a business case to a bunch of funders and saying, how can we put this together as a package versus having to chase NGOs, having to chase funds from all these different pots, and them doing the work of trying to fit them all together, which speaks to the issue of collaboration as well. You're both part of networks that really obviously see the value in collaboration among the sector, within the sector. So I don't know if you could speak more to ideas about how that model of presenting the business case to a number of funders might work. That would be one question I'd have, but
I can respond to that. I think this was more that people were like the people that we brought to speak were all very provocative speakers, and they were challenging the funders to basically get over themselves and to start allowing that kind of interaction with grantees, as opposed to making everybody contort into a pretzel. I think though, and this for me was probably the deepest insight for me that came out of this, is that, a lot of the speakers said, what are you waiting for? You love to attend webinars and you love to just theorize and read white papers and have group discussions, but these are simple changes. What is taking so long? Why can't you just make them? And I used to be one of those people saying that as well, because when I wasn't, when I was on the other side, I used to wonder, what do these funders actually do? But what the barrier is, it's not that the thing that needs to be done is hard to do. The barrier is needing to evolve their understanding of their own role. There is a genuine fear, right? That if I stop requiring all these reports and requiring, grants to be evaluated and with all these sort of bureaucratic requirements that funders have, will there be a need for my job? Will I still be employed? That's one barrier. And the other barrier is dealing with your boards, right? Every board, sometimes it's backed by, the family behind the wealth or a corporate board or whatever. They want to be able to justify the impact of their dollars. And so if you don't pull the information in this way, you can't report back on the very specific metrics that they care about. And so the work of trying to bring them on the journey that you're on, for them to also try to see themselves as part of a broader ecosystem and to let go of the very specific metrics that they have, that requires a lot of bravery on the part of the foundation executive. Have to try to kind of manage up and change, impose that sort of change on the people that employ them and their bosses. It requires a lot of personal leadership and groundedness and kind of an adherence to a mission that's broader than your job or your boss or your day, the day-to-day, but adherence to a higher mission and orienting yourself to that. And so what I realized is these really simple things are not simple when there's so much, internal work and fear that needs to be overcome to do those simple things. So I would say that that's not actually happening. This idea of just allowing groups to each write their business case and present that to whoever. But it was a provocation that was put forward.
Okay.
think if I could jump in quickly, I'd invite anyone now to turn your cameras on and really join the discussion. We have about 15 minutes left for this session, and it's been great to hear from both Devika and Dana. And I think if I could ask a quick question, and like I said in the chat, if anyone wants to ask a question or get further clarification on something, feel free to pop it in the chat, or like I said, just unmute yourself and ask the question. But for me, it's interesting to hear about thinking now in Atlantic Canada, and it's good because we'll hear from some people in Atlantic Canada who are doing that on the ground work, right? Like that grassroots work. We'll be hearing from those folks on the call today later on. But I'm wondering, Devika, you mentioned sort of that one of the things you've seen is that these place-based initiatives and these sort of grassroots organizations are doing that kind of intersectional work at that sort of level. But then at the same time, in Gamble's report, there was sort of a disconnect between place-based initiatives that were sort of, not necessarily connected. So is there a way that, we could even look at doing some of that connecting? And I think, hopefully something like this, like an event like this, where we can come together and connect, can do that. But just have a question about some of the ideas around that, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real role for, PhiLab is a great place for it to happen, but, someone to almost play like a tracking and storytelling role, I think would be really helpful to say, here's what's happening in Atlantic Canada in, these key areas. And Atlantic Canada is the place to be for X, Y, and Z. And then that's all backed up by, the place-based intersectional work that's happening. It's just like, it's actually just an investment of time and effort for someone to be the hub, to communicate with all the groups across the region who are doing the work, to know who's doing what, to categorize it in a certain way, to tell a story, and then to share that story with the rest of Canada and just even funders within Atlantic Canada, right? I think people get more excited about not just the people doing the funding, but the people doing the work get quite excited about when they understand how the thing that they're doing in this particular town or this particular community is part of a bigger story. It just elevates the level of excitement. So when I was at WWF Canada, one of the things I did was I worked with 6 different partners who were on the ground doing this kind of work, and I asked them, could we, if we had some sort of, for example, national metric like number of hectares restored by Canadians in this year, for example, and the work that you were doing, your restoration work in this particular community, this tiny little piece of forest, you could actually contribute those numbers into this bigger number. And we could say that in 2021, Canadians from coast to coast to coast restored this much land. That would that motivate you and to be able to feed into that bigger number? And I was surprised by the extent to which that really mattered to people, right? And it also is a way for then funders to understand the value of that place-based work as it contributes to the bigger picture. So, I mean, whether it's like a big environmental organization or whether it's PhiLab or somebody, there is kind of a space, I'd say, in the ecosystem for somebody to step up and play that role. I don't know who it is. I'm not from Atlantic Canada. I don't know the region well enough, but I do feel that would really help.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments they'd like to add? Nick?
I'd like to, I know Susan's on the call, and we will hear from Susan Hirschberg tomorrow as a panelist on a call, but it's interesting to hear Devika talking about, and Dana, about these sort of difficult conversations and trying to push forward in a culture that might otherwise sort of be a bit more conservative, or trying to do things in that traditional way that doesn't work, as you said, and for the next 10 years. And I think Susan has an interesting example where I think, Susan, you saw that and you were like, screw this, I'm doing it my own way.
Well, yeah, I'm doing it my own way, which partially is because I have zero previous experience in the philanthropy sector. From the Rural Communities Foundation, I'm actually more of a donor first and then a volunteer second, or the other way around. Part of it is really being problem centered. And the one thing about working with climate change is that there's an advantage in a way of it being such a difficult problem, because you just know that there's just no way to do it the way that it's been done before. So, you know, so if you start at that place where you don't know what you're doing, you really don't. And you know, and I've just really been trying to work on, okay, how do people solve these massively difficult problems? How have they historically solved them? You know, and a lot of what it is getting a bunch of people with completely different ideas in the same room, and not everybody has to do the same thing, you know, and to have it be a bit of a free form, you know, free for all, where if one person in one community thinks that the important way to deal with climate change is to plant a community garden, and another person thinks it's to create a bicycle thing, and another person wants to do an art project, there's a way of sort of just saying, okay, well, you know, it's all about the communities, trying to empower the communities with the resources they need. And I'm not going to tell you that doesn't have anything to do with climate change, because, you know, frankly, I have no idea. And so it's been actually very helpful to know that I don't know what I'm doing, but that I can still play a role in getting people together. And, you know, in my feeling, if two people talk to each other because they've had something to do with each other that I've connected, and they go off and do something that has a massive amount of momentum for them, that's a success. Whether or not I actually put in any effort to make it happen, you know, or if it just was a matter of me getting two people in the same room, you know, then change happens, and we make progress. So it's been really fun to, you know, actually to be in that very creative, you know, just kind of, well, whatever kind of space. But it is a little bit different, I think, than most foundations are able to do, and I've appreciated being able to do that.
Devika, do you think, sorry, Kelly, just one quick question there, but do you think that there's a place for, you know, that sort of perspective of, because you've spoken about how there is a sort of traditional way that things are being done, and there's, you know, that's not working, and things need to be radically different for the next decade or so, and that we're at sort of this crunch time, as you would say, but does that kind of, has that come up, I think, in maybe some of the conversations where there are these other perspectives that are outside of those, you know, silos as we see? And I think there's silos in the sector and in the environmental sector, but then also even in research and academia, really people get entrenched in their own discipline or in their studies, and they don't realize that it's part of a larger issue that you can't sort of figure out, like you said, without thinking of the economics or the policy or the culture or that, you know, these other pieces. So does that sort of, you know, I don't have any experience in this, but I'm interested, like would that perspective maybe support that conversation going forward, or maybe changing direction even? Oh, you're muted, Devika.
I think it goes back to this issue of culture shift, right? Because when we talk about what has to happen in a really bold way, most of that is stuff that needs to be government led, either in that, you know, through regulations that set different rules for what people can and cannot do, and what industry can and cannot do, or, you know, market-based incentives, or public investments from government. Like, that's ultimately where the locus of control is to bring about this very, very rapid shift. But government won't do it without culture shift, without, you know, a significant, you know, there needs to be such an inherent shift in culture. The way we've seen, for example, with gay marriage, you know, there was a massive cultural shift that happened that all of a sudden created parameters for governments, you know, different state governments, for Canada, for, you know, elsewhere, to start legislating gay marriage. But the culture shift happened first. And that was my previous point about, you know, culture is the thing that's downstream from, or sorry, that's upstream on all of it. And so, you know, this work of kind of meeting people where they're at and letting, you know, people come into the space in whatever way makes sense for them is really essential, because that's how we build a bigger tent, versus if we come in with just like, I'm talking about the issue in this particular way, emissions reductions or whatever that, you know, most people don't care about, you immediately lose a big part of the population. But working in that way is only the first step. Somehow that has to translate into culture shift being apparent enough to our politicians, such that whatever their political party, whatever their ideology, they come in knowing that, okay, if we go too far on this, if we take a step too far in this direction, the public will be mad. Or if we take a step in this direction, the public will like us more. Like, that's ultimately what needs to happen for these big changes to happen. A perfect example is the Green Belt. The Green Belt in Ontario is something that matters to Ontarians of all stripes, all, rural Ontarians, urban Ontarians, different political parties. And so the previous government did certain things to entrench the Green Belt. The next government comes in and steps on that and immediately got backlash from their own base, right? That's an example of culture shift that creates the boundaries of what can and cannot be done. And we need boundaries for politicians to do really bold things. So yeah, that's kind of my answer. And I'm just reading Dana's comment here. Yeah.
I think just supporting your point about culture shift sometimes requires kindness and tough conversations. That are at the conference, we talked about the difference between niceness and kindness, and sometimes kindness means bringing up tough and difficult things. And you can actually look at the success of gay marriage, particularly in the United States, and people committed to having tough conversations.
Yeah. But there was also, like with gay marriage, it was things like Will and Grace and Modern Family and all these TV shows that also contributed to a big culture shift. And so, these, what we say and how we talk about things really matters. Like, for example, COVID, maybe COVID's not a good example because now there's all this conversation about whether it came from a lab or not. But, a lot of things that happen in the world, the Syrian war, for example, are actually environmental issues. If COVID, with ecosystems collapsing and ice melting, all kinds of viruses are going to be unleashed on us in a much more rapid fashion. COVID was just the training wheels version of what we're up against next, just in the pandemic space alone. But we as a movement missed the opportunity to say, this is actually about the environment, right? This is about, and so a lot of it is just the way we talk about things and every opportunity we have to frame things. But it is also about, culture shift happens person to person. It happens through relationships and it happens through those conversations. So yeah, I totally agree with you, Dana, that it needs people being willing to have those brave conversations as well.
You talked about capacity building and education in some of your remarks, as well as one of the roles that your organizations play. And so I wonder about that and whether it's supporting that kind of work or doing that kind of work, but in sort of helping to share resources on how you initiate culture shift. Or I liked your idea too of supporting innovation, those really early examples of how major change might be able to happen, and because governments are often afraid to try something new, or so sort of both raising awareness and funding riskier early innovations, maybe when government wouldn't be willing to do that was another point. But that's one thing I heard you say needs to be done, but the other is this capacity building. So how to work intersectionally, how to initiate culture change, those things, kind of supporting those kinds of maybe capacity building tools to make change happen, I suppose could be important here.
Yeah, and I think a big function for both of our organizations is sharing where it is happening with other members. So for example, at our conference, we had one session that was on the role of community foundations in the environment. And there we featured 3 case studies of community foundations that are doing this, right? That we featured Unflood Ontario, which I'm happy to share the link for that. Really, really cool intersectional initiative. The other one was LC3, Low Carbon Cities Canada. Again, people coming at climate change, but from all kinds of lenses, housing and jobs and transit. And then the third one that we featured was the Winnipeg Foundation, which is Canada's oldest community foundation, and the way in which they've kind of embedded climate in the work that they're doing anyway. So yeah, there are examples, but a lot of our role is to share those examples. Recently, the Youth Climate Hub came up with a toolkit and that's a huge piece of this, right? Is youth. Like, they know how to do this, but we're sitting here talking about it, they're doing it. They're doing it every day. And so, there was a toolkit that they put out. We're sharing things like that with our members.
Great, thank you. Maybe Brady, I know we have to move on in another minute or so. Should I just, Devika or Dana, are there any closing remarks you want to make for now, or just look forward to having your contributions throughout if you can join us, or for parts, and we'll certainly share other questions that come up or comments after too.
Go for it, Devika.
Pardon, Dana?
Go for it.
Oh, I was going to say you go for it because I've been talking so much.
No worries. Yeah, I mean, I think both conferences, there's that urgency piece, and so like you just mentioned, Devika, we often talk about these things. We've been talking about this for a long time. Environmental funding has been low for a long time. I think it's time to act more, and yeah, it can be tough. It still is a challenging process, but we need to move to action.
I would second that.
Right.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for sharing, and really rich conversations at your conferences, obviously, as well. I'll pass it back to Brady, who will introduce our next panel.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you so much again for being here. And Devika will be in touch as well as with Dana. But when we do the report back, I will certainly include some of the information. Maybe we can even have a follow-up conversation about getting some members interested in the Environment Funders Canada network, seeing who we have in the region, and then really doing that connecting. And as you said, sort of taking the conversation that we're talking about now and actually putting it into action, and bringing those voices from Atlantic Canada to the national conversation, which I think will be very useful. So
yes, and sorely missing right now. So we would love to, I'd invite everyone to follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn, and for us to stay in touch, because we really do want to see a lot stronger links with the community and environment in Atlantic Canada.
awesome.
Thanks so much. I'm going to head out.
Thank you, Devika, for being here.
Okay, bye.
Bye. So we're going to move now quickly to our next panel, and we have 3 awesome students who will be joining us. Well, 2, I guess. 1 won't be joining us, but we do have a video of her. Thankfully, technology is on our side with this, and we can share her thoughts as well. So I'll just do a quick round of intros, and then maybe pass it to our 2 panelists who are on the call to just say a quick hello, and then I'll actually go with the video first, I think, and then we'll switch back to those that are here. But we have Emma Squires, who's a student in the School of Resource and Environmental Management from Simon Fraser University, Miranda Ivany, who's at the University of Guelph, and Samantha Young as well, who is at Grenfell Campus Memorial University. So maybe Miranda, I'll pass it to you for a quick hello before we get started.
Hello, everyone. My name is Miranda. I'm a student at the University of Guelph in the Rural Planning and Development program. But first and foremost, I'm from Newfoundland and have a very strong attachment to my home. And that is what ignited this interest in this research. And then I'll save the rest for later.
Awesome. Sam, over to you.
Yeah, so just as Brady was saying, so I'm Sam. I've been out in Corner Brook at Grenfell for the last 6 years, and doing this sort of really interesting work with the communities on the Northern Peninsula over the last 2 years at this point. But it's great to see you all.
Awesome. And I will say that, today is focused really around the environment and environmental giving, but 3, well, I guess Miranda and Sam are students at PhiLab, so we wanted to showcase some of their work, and there will be, I think, connections to the environment throughout, but both may not necessarily be completely about the environment, but still happy to hear from both. So what I'll do first now is I'm going to share my screen, the dreaded screen share, and see if I can play the video that Emma has sent to us. Can you see the video okay? All good?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And if you can't hear it, let me know, but if you can, I'll just let it play.
Hi everyone, my name is Emma Squires, and I'm a master's student at Simon Fraser University in the School of Resource and Environmental Management. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you live today, but I'm happy to be able to participate by video and to share a bit about my master's research that's looking at rural and place-based environmental philanthropy in the Skeena region of British Columbia. Just a bit of background on this research. So it's part of a broader research initiative that's a collaboration between 3 universities across Canada: Simon Fraser, the University of Guelph, and Memorial University. And the research project is funded by the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada, and it's taking a multi-case study approach with case studies in BC, Ontario, and New Brunswick. So my research is providing one of these case studies and looking at environmental philanthropy in the northwest of BC. The research objective is to examine the emergence of place-based philanthropy as a mechanism for rural revitalization and development. And this research is asking 3 main questions. How is place-based philanthropy being used in rural Canada? How can place-based philanthropy enhance rural sustainability? And how does place-based philanthropy modify our understanding of rural economic and community development? So I'll just give a brief background on some of the literature that my research is grounded in. So a key characteristic of rural places is that they're very rich in natural capital, and it's a unique asset that really supports local quality of life and provides opportunities for economic diversification. But these natural assets are under threat in a lot of places due to unsustainable resource extraction and the impacts of climate change. And rural governments have limited capacity to respond because of their expansive mandates and their small tax bases. But protecting and promoting natural capital is critical to rural resilience and revitalization, and natural assets can really be a pillar of place-based sustainable development. In many rural communities, the philanthropic sector has really stepped up to fill some of the gaps left by government withdrawal. Rural communities have a higher proportion of philanthropic organizations per capita. There are over 18,000 rural philanthropic organizations across the country, and there's been a growing attention to the role of the philanthropic sector in building community and environmental resilience. So my research takes place in the Skeena watershed, which is an area roughly the size of Nova Scotia in the northwest of BC. It's home to about 60,000 people. Terrace and Smithers are 2 of the main population centers in the region, and Prince Rupert and Kitimat just lie on the border of the watershed. And it's also the traditional and unceded territories of a number of First Nations, including the Tsimshian, Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en, and Tahltan peoples. Not only is it an incredibly beautiful area of the province, but it's also richly endowed with natural assets. It's one of the most productive and biologically diverse watersheds in Canada, and it's also one of the most important salmon watersheds in the world. It's home to all 5 species of Pacific salmon and steelhead trout, and salmon are really a cornerstone of local culture and identity. They're also very economically important to the region, and they've been valued at contributing over $110 million annually. But the region is also a globally significant contributor of natural resources, including oil and gas, mining, and forestry, and there's a major port in the city of Prince Rupert. And so because of the tension of industrialized and ecologically significant environment, a robust environmental philanthropy sector has really developed in the region with a number of locally based nonprofits, societies, foundations, and trusts that have environmentally oriented mandates. But the region is really in a state of transition. Economically, local governments are advocating for change because most of the economic activity from industrial projects ends up leaving the region and providing little economic benefit to local communities. The region is facing an infrastructure deficit that's estimated at $600 million. And industrial activity is also having negative impacts on the local environment. And climate change is only going to make these impacts even more severe by putting additional stresses on the ecosystems. For example, the wild salmon population has declined by 70% over the last century. And the Northwest BC Resource Benefit Alliance, which is an association of 21 local governments, has said our communities are vastly unprepared to support what may come about in the future. So as the region navigates these challenges and aims to rechart its course, my research asks, what role does environmental philanthropy play in regional development and sustainability in the Skeena? So I took a qualitative case study approach to this research, and I conducted semi-structured interviews with 19 participants. Participants were from local NGOs, government representatives, and First Nations groups. And I then transcribed and analyzed the data using NVivo software and coded it to identify key themes. And this research is very much still in progress, but the preliminary findings show that place-based environmental philanthropy in the region is playing a really important role in regional development. It's bringing in significant external capital and blending it with local capacity. It's promoting dialogue about regional development, and it's creating regional specific environmental data. And it's also supplementing the capacities of local governments and First Nations. I'll have more to share on my findings once my research is complete in September 2021. And one of my final deliverables will also include a community report to share back to the region and to all those who participated in the research. Thanks so much for listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or my supervisor. Our emails are both right here. And Sean is also going to be speaking in the next panel, so you're welcome to ask him any questions as well. And if you'd like to receive a copy of my research once it's complete, please reach out and I'll include your email on my distribution list. Thanks so much and enjoy the rest of the session.
Awesome. I hope that that worked as well for everyone else as it worked for me, because I am shocked that it was that easy to do that. So that's great. So as Emma said, if there are any questions for her, her email is there, and I'll also put her email in the chat there in a second. And then you can send any questions directly, or if you'd like to ask me or others to pass along questions, and I can as well, and to put you in contact. But also Dr. Sean Markey, who is her supervisor, will also be joining us later on this afternoon. So you can ask any questions directly to him, and he may try to answer as best he can. So next, I'd like to pass it on, and what we can do is we'll save any questions till the end, but feel free as we go to put questions in the chat if you have some, and then after all the panelists are finished, we can ask the questions and begin the discussion. So feel free to just pop questions in the chat whenever you have them, and then I'll make sure that they're asked at the end. So next, we'll pass it over to Miranda.
All right, can you see it?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Like I said before, my name is Miranda, and I'm a student at the Rural Planning and Development program at the University of Guelph. And today I'm going to be sharing an overview and some of the highlights of the research project that I've been working on called Rural Philanthropy: Mapping Patterns of Charitable Giving in Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada's Atlantic region. So rural philanthropy is often considered a core social norm in small and rural communities. It manifests in the propensity of local service clubs, individuals, and entire communities that band together to support those who are struggling. More formal types of philanthropic organizations, such as charities and nonprofits, are traditionally dedicated to furthering a particular social or environmental cause or advocating for a shared point of view. In Canada, the nonprofit and charitable sectors make significant contributions to their local communities and to larger global society. And this can be seen in 2017, Canada's nonprofit sector generated $169.2 billion, which represents 8.5% to Canada's total GDP. This can also be coupled with the recent history where we've seen the dissolution of economic and community development boards and an increased downloading of services and responsibilities onto local levels of government and non-governmental organizations all across Canada, including Newfoundland. So rural philanthropy and its ability to advance rural development and sustainable rural communities is an emerging field of research. However, little academic attention has examined the challenges, barriers, and advantageous conditions faced by small and rural environmental organizations in Newfoundland specifically. So this research sought to fill this gap by examining these experiences of environmental charities in Newfoundland to better understand their relationships with charitable giving and their experiences within the sector in Newfoundland. So the goal of this project was fairly broad. It was to contribute to the discourse on philanthropy in rural Canada, and more specifically Newfoundland, and it was addressed by 3 objectives. The first was to identify existing patterns of philanthropy, specifically formal environmental philanthropy in Newfoundland and Atlantic Canada. The second was to outline the benefits, barriers, and challenges, and barriers that environmental organizations face in gaining charitable status or engaging in the charitable sector as a whole. And the third was to identify support needed for environmental, charitable, and nonprofit organizations in Newfoundland. So the methods used in this project was a mixed methods design, and we followed, the first thing we did was a systematic literature review and jurisdictional scan. And then the second was a review and analysis of secondary statistical data from Canada Revenue Agency to look at overarching trends in Newfoundland and Atlantic Canada. And lastly, we conducted 16 semi-structured interviews with key informants from a pool of NGOs in Newfoundland. So I'll spend most of this time going over the findings. So there were a number, and they'll be organized by challenges and benefits that came out. So there were a number of challenges expressed by environmental charities and nonprofits in Newfoundland, and some of the most significant ones included the experience of having a limited human capacity. 75% of the individuals that participated in the study shared that they belonged to an organization with one part-time or full-time employee, or they were entirely volunteer run. So participants expressed that the significant time constraints faced by their team members has impacted their ability to get work done effectively and efficiently. As well, securing the financial means to continue an organization's activity was expressed as a challenge due to organizations often relying on grants that they're required to apply and reapply for time and time again. Time constraints and inconsistent access to funding was associated with difficulties such as extending the organization's activities, applying for charitable status, or even building stronger relationships with other environmental organizations in the province. And then lastly, participants stated that they experienced challenges around connecting with other environmental organizations due to the relative inactivity of the main coordinating environmental organization in Newfoundland, who themselves have been struggling and were previously responsible for disseminating important knowledge and networking opportunities for environmental organizations specifically. And while there were a number of challenges expressed by participants, there were also a number of benefits. And one of the benefits was that all participants that participated shared that obtaining and maintaining a charitable designation increased their sense of freedom that they felt around being able to apply for a greater number of funding opportunities because of the designation. Another benefit expressed by participants that held a charitable designation was that it was believed to increase social legitimacy for organizations. So participants said that they believed being a registered charity conveyed to their community that they would appropriately manage their money, and that they were committed to building something long-term for their community to serve the best interests of their community. And lastly, another advantageous condition experienced by all participants was that they believed that they had good connections and support from their local communities, and organizations. And this was connected to their programming and the reality that it was more typically well received because of these supports within their community, and it allowed them to partner with other organizations on projects. So why does this all matter? It matters because being able to understand the challenges, barriers, and advantageous conditions better helps us to conceptualize what might be needed to support organizations to carry out their activities and to become more sustainable and resilient in the long term. Further, by addressing challenges in alternative ways, it may help to support meaningful internal and external communication and collaboration to successfully harness collective power within the sector and to continue to advance the social and environmental development work that's already being done in Newfoundland. Thank you, everyone. I didn't put my email address on the slide, but I can get Brady to share that later.
Yes, I'll put that in the chat. That's no worries. And I'll pass it over to Sam. Thank you so much, Miranda.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I guess I will also just share my screen if I can not ruin this. Okay, let's see. I wanted to share with you guys specifically a presentation that I had given to a community partner that I had been working with through PhiLab. So I wanted to kind of give you guys a better understanding of what the research that I have been doing, how I sort of integrated it into the community in a way that could be understood, not just in an academic context, as a lot of us, I can assume, are so easy to using, but trying to make it more acceptable and easily understandable to everyone. So this was about social enterprise models for the GNPCP, which was the Great Northern Peninsula Community Place. I wanted to start the presentation for you guys with a little bit of information just about that space itself. So the presentation was built for the board of directors of the Great Northern Peninsula Community Place in Port au Choix. So I've tried to put a little X, it's that orange X on that Northern Peninsula right there. And then the purple area is what is considered the Great Northern Peninsula. So this community place is going to be one within what was going to be a network of hubs dispersed across the Great Northern Peninsula. So there right now is one hub that is placed in Norris Point in Gros Morne. There's the Port au Choix hub, and there is also work being done in this same sort of collective surrounding St. Anthony. So those are all within that purple area there. So there was a couple questions that I was being asked, both by the community and through my own research that I wanted to kind of touch on and work on. So how could a social enterprise be structured to ensure effective service provision and financial viability in rural Newfoundland? What role would philanthropic activity play in rural social sustainability? And can the establishment of a social enterprise spur new philanthropic activity? So there's lots of questions in there, and it was a very positive experience to kind of try be looking for answers there. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that the community groups that I was working with, that they understood the different options for business models that might work for them. So the social business model was one of the ones that I had looked at that I brought up to the community group that I thought would be possibly good for them to work on, which would be a focus on blended value models, taking into account the wants and needs of shareholders while ensuring those needs fall in line with the social environmental values set by the enterprise. So these sorts of enterprises so often give so many benefits, not just to the community group itself, but to the community as a whole, and helps bring people together to build on ideas and grow the community through a social enterprise model. So how would a social enterprise benefit the community? I wanted to come up with a couple ideas of things that this community could definitely see benefits from, and that would make them want to work on this themselves. So it was to create a space for community events to occur. While there are spaces in the community, this community hub would have a community kitchen, which would also offer food for these events, and that would also create another financial stream for this group, and also show that there is an opportunity for growth in the community. So often it has seemed in Newfoundland that people think that rural areas are dying, and as we all know, as people that do this, it isn't the case. And so having a social enterprise like this shows that community how all of these things are connected. I wanted to give a couple of examples of different social enterprises that were working in different parts of the country. So this was Common Roof, which is working out of Ontario, which is a community business center that houses multiple nonprofits under the same roof. This would also work for the idea of the Great Northern Peninsula Community Place, just because that was going to open up spaces for multiple people to work in a social enterprise setting. So this enterprise can also be reorganized for health practitioners, which was one of the things that we were hoping to look at. And it also created a space for like-minded neighbors and group interaction. So by having all of these things in one space, it really helps bring that community of people that are working on this together. Another one that I wanted to bring up to the community and that I also think is very cool for you all is the Shorefast Foundation. So this is a foundation out of Newfoundland right now on Fogo Island, having 3 separate social enterprises running under one umbrella foundation. So the integrity of place is one of the most important things to the Shorefast Foundation, and having that idea of collective place and the importance of that is one thing that they really focus on. So now, because of how the Shore Fest Foundation has been run and that they have a hotel as one of their social enterprises, it's now an internationally recognized enterprise. And it also shows how it's very important to have space for tourism within your social enterprise, and understanding that bringing other people into your communities can benefit you for so many different ways. So I wanted to make sure that I had pretty set down ideas of what we can learn from these examples that I had shared. Some of these things were that a project like this, or a project like any social enterprise, can be scaled up. It doesn't have to start as big as you want it to be in the long run, but by starting at a small scale, you can grow it. Another thing that I wanted to bring up was that consistent conversation with the community is what makes things work. Even if you have so many people that are so interested in building a community social enterprise, if the whole community itself does not want it, it will not flourish the way that you would like it to. The community place can also use that common roof model for health workers. So that would be allowing health practitioners of physiotherapists or doctors or anything like that coming in and working together with other people in the area that also want to see the exact same things done for them. Fulfilling many needs in one community space is another value that I thought would be very important to bring up to this community group. And it was also very important to bring up that social enterprise can be done in rural Newfoundland. So often it seems like that isn't an option, and I wanted to make sure that this community did recognize that these were possibilities for themselves. And that was kind of all I had for you guys. I wanted to try and run through it as fast as possible, but this was the type of information that I wanted to share with that community, and this was the way that I wanted to share it, both in an academic and a community lens. So thank you very much. And there is my question, yeah.
And I put that email as well as Miranda's and Emma's in the chat if anyone would like to get in touch with anyone. And we have about 3 to 5 minutes now for a few questions, if there are any. Feel free to turn your camera on and ask a question, or like I said, pop it in the chat. And I invite anyone who's on the call to turn their cameras on if you are interested in doing that, keeping in mind that of course we are recording, just so you know. But are there any questions for either of the panelists that are here with us today? I have some myself, but I'll open it up in case there are others. So hearing none, and my question really is, and I'm also a graduate student, so I can relate to a lot of the things that you're saying. Was there any specific impact that the pandemic had on either of your work? You know, knowing that a lot of it is sometimes community-based, and I know, Miranda, you're in Ontario and working here in Newfoundland. So maybe, Miranda, I'll go to you first, if there was any sort of impact from the pandemic on some of your work and results.
Yeah, so one of the impacts, I had reached out to about 40 organizations in Newfoundland to try and get as broad of a reach as I could. And we only had 16 organizations that agreed to participate. And so it's believed that that's partly due to COVID. Like going back to the limited human capacity that I found in the research, I think that they're already stretched fairly thin, and then COVID really turned everything upside down. And I think that's how it impacted it. And some organizations, more like how it affected them, a lack of physical infrastructure or operating spaces was expressed by a number of people. They didn't have their own space to work out of, so they would use community rooms or like in the Sobeys or in a library or cafe. And because of COVID, those spaces were no longer accessible, and everything had to move online, and that became a challenge for communicating and accessing information more easily.
Awesome. Sam, anything to add to that one there before I move on to the next question?
I mean, it affected everything. I was really lucky that I had the opportunity, almost like very close to the beginning of COVID, to be able to go out to the community that I was working in and kind of get those a few connections. And the fact that the Great Northern Peninsula, the collective that I was working with, they had the capability to be working online. I think if there had been a lot more people involved, it would have made it a much bigger challenge, but I was very lucky. is definitely how it worked out.
Awesome. We have one question in the chat that I'll go to before we take a quick break now before our next panel. But Myra asks, how is rural NL seen in regards to tourism outside of the province? And how is rural NL seen as a potential place to visit? And maybe I'll go to Sam first.
It's not as much as I don't really know very much about that. I would hope to think that, especially now, a lot more people from outside of the province but still inside of Canada want to be coming here because of how wonderful it seems as a place, but also how safe it has been. These would all be things that I think would kind of help bring people into rural Newfoundland and not just to St. John's and those main centers, because people are seeing the value of what we all have here.
Do you think that organizations like the Shore Fast Foundation play a role in that, like philanthropy itself?
They definitely do. So the Shore Fast Foundation, and the way that they do it is they, with their hotel, they also have a sort of, it's like a nutritional sheet. They have a nutritional facts sheet, but it's about where your money is going when you spend money with that social enterprise. So it's 12% of the money that you spend on your hotel room goes towards building this community kitchen or something like that. And it's interesting to see something done that way, because it's not seen, I haven't seen it in very many other places.
The last word I'll give to Miranda.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I know exactly how it's viewed outside the province, but in my experience, I often tell people immediately I'm from Newfoundland. And everyone I've ever spoken to is like, I've been to Newfoundland, I've been trying to get to Newfoundland, and they usually talk about the rural areas. They usually talk about the beauty of the environment and wanting to get out and explore that. So I think it's a really interesting thing that could potentially be harnessed to increase tourism.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, both of you, and to Emma, who's not here, of course, but for being here and for sharing your research. As Kelly said in the chat, it's great to see you. I think both of you were sort of our first students that were working with us through PhiLab. So it's been great to see your research from start to finish, and now sort of moving on to bigger and better things, and to see some of these results coming out. So thank you again for sharing.
Miranda defends next week, so.
Awesome. Well, good luck on that. That's awesome. And yeah, I think at this point, I'll pass it over to Dr. Richards.
Great. Thanks very much, Brady. My apologies, everybody. I was actually at a conference right until 4 o'clock today, so I'm just joining, but I'm happy to moderate this session called Sustaining Environmental Organizations. So my name is Garrett Richards. I'm an assistant professor with the Environmental Policy Institute at Grenville campus, and I'm really excited about this topic and about PhiLab's activities because I have an interest in environmental charities. I have an interest in how the nonprofit sector can participate in the policy process. And I'm lucky to coordinate a fairly new initiative called the Environmental Policy Innovation Lab, which has and will work with some environmental nonprofits and other stakeholder organizations. So really happy to hear from our panelists today and learn from this session. I'm happy to introduce them now. So we have joining us today Darren Sheppard from the Indian Bay Ecosystem Corporation. We also have Lanna Campbell from the Nature Conservancy of Canada in PEI. And we have Sean Markey from Simon Fraser University. So each of these panelists is going to have up to 10 minutes to speak. And I think Brady is going to give each person a 2-minute warning if they get up to 8 minutes. So unless there are any questions about the format, any questions about the actual material should be saved to our Q&A at the end. I think I'll pass it over to Darren and encourage him to speak on our topic, sustaining environmental organizations. Go ahead, Darren.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I'm Darren Sheppard. I'm the manager here at IBEC, Indian Bay Ecosystem Corporation. For those wondering, we're located on the northeast coast of the island of Newfoundland, so it can get pretty cold here and also pretty warm. But we're ENGO, been in the business for 33 years, incorporated. Operating area, when this was developed, it was developed for the Indian Bay watershed, which is a fairly small area. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we've expanded our reach per se. We now cover the total northeast coast of the island for whatever we're doing for all types of work. And I even travel the province doing contract work for DFO, training the trainer, excuse me. So if you look at it that way, I wear my IBEC hat pretty much throughout the province. We have 2 full-time employees, not bad for a nonprofit. 2 part-time employees, various numbers of summer students. A little bit different from what I heard earlier. We actually own our own building. So I don't need to go to Sobeys or sit in the Tim Hortons and try to conduct work. So we have our own building. We have multiple office space. We have a boardroom, and we have a garage area. So we can store our Skidoo side-by-side, fishing gear, equipment, boats, and everything like that downstairs. So that's really helpful. Over our 33-year lifespan, we've had 150 different types of projects. These range from cleanups to river restoration, trail development to water testing, shorebird studies, and I'll talk about in a couple more minutes, our own very own podcast. So self-promotion, I help create it. So I'm just going to promote it myself. We're also governed by a board of directors. There's 12. We currently have 9, but that's fine. All of them are within the area or have a distinct connection with the area. Dr. Vaden is one of those board members, and she kindly asked me to do this today. So hi, Kelly. So let's get to the meat and potatoes here. So sustaining environmental organizations. So we're kind of small. We don't have any national bodies here. We don't have any big brother, big sister we can call it and say, hey, can you give me $100,000 because I kind of need the money. So we really got to look for various programs and funders. That includes federal government, private funders such as the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation. They have been really, 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 hi Kelly, she wrote me. So Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation, provincial government, and fundraising. So basically any type of money we can get our hands on, we have to reach for that. One thing I've learned in my 3 years here is I have to be adaptable. You have to be willing to understand change. You have to be able to change. If you don't want to change, you're not going to last very long in a nonprofit. When it comes to change, we have to look at how to find other ways to fund. That's where we're here, and that we are now starting charity status application, which I'm sure some of you are really good at, and I'm pulling out my hair because it's very long and very frustrating, but it started. So we're hopeful in another year we'll be able to get some money that way. So that'd be wonderful. And when I said change, well, creating your own podcast out of nothing is what we did. One of my previous project coordinators, I walked in one day and she was listening to murder mysteries on a podcast. And I'm like, what is that? She's like, it's a podcast. I'm like, okay, could we do that? She's like, yeah. So 24 shows later, the name is 709 Watershed. It's on all major podcast apps. Please look at, subscribe if you like. We talk about tourism, we talk about environmental issues, we talk to politics, we talk to business leaders, anything and everything. If it has connection with the watershed, we will try to talk about it. So we're getting our names out there in international land on the web, so that's helpful. Also, strong social media presence is required. So we have Instagram, we have 2 accounts for that. We have Twitter, we have a major Facebook page. We have our main website, which is Kelly has just posted, so that's there. So being out there and being able to be found is another key component. We have a major species at risk Cape Fears project through Environment and Climate Change Canada. That's a 4-year project. We're down there now dealing with shorebird species at risk, human interaction with species, how they interact with each other. Humans kind of screw things up and they're basically scaring away all the shorebirds. So we're down there trying to figure out how to stop that. We also have strong partnerships. We have strong partnerships with local towns, Kitty Wake Snowmobile Association, Indian Bay ATV Association. So we help with the tourism aspect of the watershed. We have a major trail system that goes through our watershed, ATVs all year round, snowmobiles in wintertime, major cabins. There's at least 400 cabins in the watershed. Anybody and everybody, if they want to donate to us, we will gladly take their money. But if we work with them and promote the area, that also helps that we're with them. We're not against them. And in the years past, there has been friction. It was always us against them, environmentalists against people who want to go fishing or want to use stuff. Well, it's better if you work together than keep pounding fists. Fundraising. I have a hat. If you want to buy this, we will sell this to you. We also have wool hats and t-shirts. We've got to adapt. So, hey, if you want to have a little bit of IBEC today, just look us up on the website. We're there. Just write me a message. I'll send you a hat. Also, we have to look at different kind of projects. We're not just salmon and trout anymore. We do culverts, we do aquatic restoration, we do river restoration, like you said, podcasts. Anything that we can think of to do money, to bring funding in, to keep us employed, to employ students, to employ part-time students, we do that. And lastly, we're now getting into potentially trout hatchery. We're looking at trying to help nature with increasing the trout population in the watershed, take the pressure off the ponds because of so many cabins, so many fishers in there going at it. We figured let's try to help that. So if we can keep the tourism going, keep people happy with fishing, but yet just help nature along, not totally make it into like 1 million trout everywhere and everywhere. Just slightly help nature, then everything keeps moving along at a nice little flow and everyone's happy. So when it comes to sustainability, man, anything and everything. So that's our name of the game, and we've been doing that for my 3 years here, and I hope that keeps going for another 33 years, if not longer. I'm done.
Great. Thanks so much, Darren. So I'll pass things over to Lanna next. Go ahead, Lanna.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lanna, coming at you from Epiquik, which is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples of PEI, also known as PEI. From Charlottetown today, where I live with my husband and 2 young kids. But before that, I used to live in Newfoundland. I'm very familiar with that Indian Bay watershed. I know exactly where that building is. So I am the program director of the Nature Conservancy of Canada here on PEI. We are a nationwide national charity. We are Canada's leading land conservation organization. So we are a land trust that operates across the country. I've been with NCC for 8 years next week, the first 5 of which I spent in St. John's, and now I work on PEI. So I have a thing for islands. I just hopped islands. So as a program director with the Nature Conservancy, I lead NCC's conservation work in the province, which is what I did in Newfoundland, which is what I do here. So I lead the conservation work here. So I don't necessarily only do philanthropy. It is an element of what I do. So oftentimes when you get hired into a charitable organization, you're told that everyone's a fundraiser. As much as what Darren had mentioned, you learn to adapt and sort of do it all. But there are people who work with the Nature Conservancy Canada whose main job is to fundraise for the organization. So we are a nationwide group. So there, like I said, there's over 350 people that work with NCC across the country. And so there's lots of people whose main job it is to focus on philanthropy or development is what we call it in our world. Yeah, so it's always been an element of our work. So and I was trying to think of sort of some of the pieces I could share around the fundraising element of what we do. So as a charity, our donors and our partners are crucial to our success. So we've been around for a really long time, almost 60 years. And so without sort of that support that we gain, we wouldn't be able to do our works either nationally or locally. And I'll talk about the difference between that a little bit and how difficult it is to struggle with that. So we engage all different types of donors, from corporate supporters, foundations, organizations, individuals, and governments. For instance, we're actually currently working within a public-private partnership with the Government of Canada. So this is something that the Nature Conservancy Canada has done a couple times. So right now we're working under one called the Natural Heritage Conservation Program. It's basically an opportunity for the NCC to have access to federal dollars to advance an initiative that the country feels really passionate about, which is the protection of Canada's natural spaces. So they sort of we're sort of a client, they sort of contract us out to achieve targets that they are aiming to achieve, which is, 30% by 2030. So they have these really ambitious conservation targets. And so they will, funnel money into organizations that help them meet their targets, of which NCC would be one of them. So we get to access federal dollars, which is incredible. We can only access them if we bring other money to the table. So it's kind of like a potluck. So you can't really eat unless you bring something to the table. So we still have to raise lots of dollars to unlock those funds. So we work with all of the types of donors to be able to access those funds and to be able to do our work. We can share and collaborate with the NCC team across the country, but we primarily work within our region. So as long as I've been with NCC, I've worked in the Atlantic region. So we sort of, these 4 little provinces are over here doing our own thing. And so we belong to this sort of big brother organization, but we are in charge of delivering our own programs and funding our own funds. So, the work that we do here in Atlantic Canada is often funded by money that we raise here in Atlantic Canada, or maybe we're going to raise it with entities that have that Atlantic Canadian pull, that wish to be on the East Coast, live elsewhere, but they're going to invest in the East Coast. We've talked to a lot of people that do this too. So the work that we do here, so for instance, and this is kind of the difference of working with a national entity. So ideas and campaigns and fundraising campaigns will come out of our head office in Toronto or come out of some really big idea think tanks across the country. And then we need to take it and make it relevant to Atlantic Canada. And then I also need to take it and make it relevant to Prince Edward Island. And so you have this, this struggle to sort of make campaigns relevant and make them connect with people to where you are. So there's a benefit of having the support of a larger national entity, but you also have to come across as having grassroots types initiatives and still working locally. So this is something that we struggle with all the time, because obviously we're, for lack of a better word, sort of competing with other smaller island-based charities. People who are, figuring out where to put their charitable dollars may not prioritize the Nature Conservancy Canada because we have Canada in our name. They think we're a government, they think we're bigger. And so we're always kind of navigating that space of local versus of bigger organizations. And so it's always something that we struggle with, is how to tell our stories locally and how to make them important locally. So I was listening this afternoon, some of the talks were so interesting, and it actually spurred on this this thought for me, which is obviously when we fundraise, our gold star is unrestricted funding. We love it whenever organizations or individuals, corporations, governments can just sort of give us money and then we get to go and put it where it's needed. We like it whenever our funders trust our science-driven process and they trust that we know what we're doing with their funds. But it's not how it always works, as you know, as you can imagine. So, a lot of the funding that we may receive from corporations, organizations, and mostly individuals like to invest in projects. They like to feel really connected to projects. So they like to know that their dollars went exactly to this item. And so often when you're fundraising for that item, it doesn't help you keep the lights on. It doesn't help you pay salaries. It doesn't help cover the admin fees. So it's something that we're dealing with all the time. We try to do a combination of both. So for instance, we may have a fundraising campaign where we're fundraising to conserve biodiversity in Canada, but then we may also have another mini campaign underway where we're asking people to help us protect this specific piece of land, these specific 100 acres. And we're trying to teach donors that we prefer the conserving biodiversity campaign, because then that allows us to have more movement in our work, and it just it gives us more just our ability to adapt and move. But oftentimes it's those campaigns for the 100 acres that bring in certain donors or bring in new donors because they want to feel like their dollar went exactly to that property. So this is something grapple with all the time. But all that to say, we take donor stewardship really seriously. We have people that work with NCC who this is their job. We do our best to bring them with us on our journey, to convince them that what they're doing is a good decision. But we also do really silly things like name boats after them. I have a boat on PEI. It's named after a donor. It was her wishes. It really. She paid for the boat, so she wanted to name it. So it really just depends. And then I guess I'll end on this little note. So if I can think about some of the stories that we're telling now, is yes, that we're talking about the conservation of biodiversity and all those kind of things when we think about how we're fundraising for our work. But we also tell a lot of stories right now about connecting nature to mental health. And so this is sort of the direction of our language lately. And this is some of the conversations that we've definitely been having since COVID-19, and how people are seeking nature to as a space to spread out, to feel fulfilled. And so we do things sort of similar to what Darren was talking about, just to sort of get people in nature. And we think that if we get people outside and we get them loving nature, and we come up with things like backyard birding or nationwide bio blitzes and like all these initiatives that get people outside in the hopes that we create nature lovers. And when they, Christmas time rolls around and they're thinking about charitable giving, they're going to think about where are those nature organizations, because I love nature, so I'm going to invest in nature. And so we're trying to think about the sort of the full picture to create those long-term donors. So that they can continue to think about nature. And I think that people, when they think about where they want to give around Christmas, again, this is when I do my charitable giving, they might pick a nature organization, they might pick a social organization or an ocean one. And so we're trying to sort of plant seeds that people think about us and they become longer term donors. Anyway, so that's a little bit about what we do.
Thanks so much, Lanna. Very interesting. And I'll pass things over to Sean. Go right ahead.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's still morning out here on the West Coast. Thanks very much for the invitation to join you today. I'm glad that I joined after the quiz. Brady labeled that as a poll, but it sounded a little bit more like a quiz, putting some high pressure on the attendance here. I'm coming to you today in my basement here on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam peoples. I'm very thankful to those nations. I've worked on projects with many of them, and I just so appreciate their generosity and their willingness to share Indigenous knowledge holders with the students and some of the research that I'm involved in. What I want to talk to you today is a continuation of work that Emma Squires, a master's student working with me here at Simon Fraser University, this is the foundation of her master's thesis work. And we're looking at place-based environmental philanthropy in the Skeena region in Northwest British Columbia. I'll tell you a little bit about the project, although I think most of you may have seen the video that she was on earlier in your conference. The grand thesis of this work related to the specific topic of this panel, however, is that the organizations that we've looked at and interviewed with are incredibly impactful. And I think that level of impact, I'm not entirely sure is well recognized. And I think it speaks maybe a little bit to some of Lanna's comments there in terms of, working with funders and building that relationship of trust in terms of the work that they're doing. And also what has really struck me is how incredibly interconnected the work is that they're doing. They're labeled as conservation organizations, however, they're getting involved in a whole variety of other activities. And both the impact and that interconnectedness are really enhanced and amplified by a place-based approach to doing environmental philanthropy. So, but that if you would like to tune out the rest of this, that's the real key takeaways that we can bring back on the discussion part. Yeah, so I'll tell you a bit about the project, frame it within context of rural restructuring, and then talk specifically about those two things, impact and interconnectedness. For those of you that missed Emma's presentation earlier, this is part of a cross-Canada wide project looking at the role of place-based philanthropy. This specific sub-research project speaks specifically to environmental philanthropy, but working with Ryan Gibson at Guelph, Kelly, who's on the call here, Memorial, Boyan is involved. Is involved in the project as well, and a number of really amazing students that we're working with as well. Again, the project as a whole has much sort of larger frame in terms of looking at looking at philanthropy more generally, and place-based philanthropy as a driver of responding to trends in rural restructuring. Which we have seen through this project and in other work, of course, that rural and small town places have undergone tremendous changes over the last sort of 30 years, primarily owing to sort of more neoliberal or market-oriented approaches to policy and programs. It's led to significant levels of withdrawal in terms of infrastructure, services, things like that, all of which have put downward pressure on local organizations to respond in terms of continuing to do the work, continuing to provide services. On the positive side, this has resulted in the emergence of some pretty incredible place-based solutions, but there are concerns around capacity and offloading without any sense of resourcing, for example. So there's been some pretty wonderful local responses, but often stretched very severely in terms of capacity, both in terms of general resources and knowledge to deal with some of the complexity of issues that rural and small town places are facing. This work specifically in terms of Emma's research work, obviously a bit of a different experience over the past year than we have anticipated. We're still involved in the sort of crunching of the data, but she did 19 key informant interviews, document analysis around all of the different organizations, environmental projects going on in the Northwest. So our tremendous thanks to all the people that took time out of their incredibly busy schedules, especially this past year, to still talk to us about the work and share some of their passion that they have about the work in their region. Again, for those of you that weren't part of the presentation, here's the Skeena watershed. It's an extraordinarily ecologically productive region. It's the second most productive salmon-bearing region in Canada after the Fraser River, just south of where I am right now. It's about 60,000 people. And because of the ecological significance of the area, the role and participation and engagement with Indigenous nations in the region, the extent to which the region has been an epicenter of pretty significant industrial activity. It is the northern sort of component of the Great Bear Rainforest. It has been a focal point of tremendous amounts of environmental philanthropy and environmental conservation work. The organizations, though, there's an extraordinarily long list for a region of this size: Skeena Wild Conservation Trust, Northwest Institute for Bioregional Research, Bulkley Valley Research Center, Skeena Nass Center for Innovation and Resource Economics, Skeena Watershed Conservation Coalition, Watershed Watch Salmon Society, EcoTrust Canada, Morris Walker Monitoring Trust, Northern Confluence Initiative, Skeena Knowledge Trust, Friends of the Wild Salmon, T-Buck Suzuki Foundation, amongst others. And the list just keeps going on. It's like an extraordinarily busy landscape from a research and conservation perspective. And again, also within the unceded territories of a variety of nations, the Tsimshian, the Gitxsan, the Wet'suwet'en, and the Tahltan peoples, just to name a few. Okay, so getting down into sort of the core components here, impact, just an extraordinary level of impact that these organizations have had, bringing, I think, quite tremendous sophistication along a continuum of environmental philanthropy, right? Where you have sort of peer advocacy on one hand, and you have sort of more research-oriented focus on the other. This is important to note that this is not a region that is shy of industrial projects. There's tremendous amounts of industrial activity taking place in the region. Forestry, pipeline activity, the Kitimat Alcan smelter is located in this region that just underwent a $5 billion renovation plan, and there's now Kitimat 2 or Alcan 2 project underway. It's the confluence for pipeline projects that many of you may have sort of heard about in the news around some of the issues of non-ceded territories going through the Wet'suwet'en territory, for example, and the national protests that erupted as a result of some of that activity. But as you can see from this quote from one of our research participants, the work of these conservation organizations have been incredibly impactful, right? That from, stopping fracking up in the sacred headwaters, blocking the Enbridge pipeline, stopping fish farms, on and on and on, like some really big, heavy-hitting, major projects with big backers, serious dollars, serious campaign dollars, and these organizations played really critical role in sort of both marshaling local resources and sort of local attention to these issues, in addition to facilitating some of the external actor interest in the region. For example, larger sort of national and international conservation organizations, for example, that got involved. So, as we're continuing to work through the data, but I just, to bring to bear that these organizations have been extraordinarily impactful, and with some projects that have some really big numbers attached to them and big capacity attached to them as well. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The whole sort of component of place here has been really, really interesting to sort of drill down into and get to understand more. One is, I think, as we've heard from Darren and Lanna, just the way in which local people, as sort of that place-based approach has been fostered and facilitated over the years, have really, really value the quality of life, the quality of the environment. That pertains obviously to the indigenous nations in the region going back since time immemorial, but also the settler communities who are sort of looking into the future about what their own quality of life, what their own economy could look like going into the future. Participants spoke to the extent to which sort of that place-based focus and sort of bringing regional actors together transcended, some traditional political affiliations that may have led to more tension. I like this line from the interviewee: strange allies, right? Didn't really anticipate working with these people or this organization, but here we are. We found a sort of a larger common interest because of our concern and care for this region. And then, the next sort of main theme that I wanted to sort of bring to the attention here this morning or this afternoon, it's now afternoon here too, so we're all on the same PM schedule. This tremendous interconnectedness, right? That you sort of might think more narrowly in terms of conservation or conservation organizations, but they're playing really complex interconnected roles. Certainly blending the capacities and resources of local with extra local actors that I just talked about in a minute ago. Facilitating trust amongst different sort of strange allies in the region. There's some really interesting regional development spillover taking place as these relationships have been fostered. They're starting to have different conversations and sort of framed within this propose, not oppose. If we played a significant role in opposing some of these major projects that we don't think are the right thing for this region, then what are we in favor of? What kind of an economy do we want? What does a restoration economy look like in this Northwest region of British Columbia? How do we involve Indigenous stakeholders in that conversation? What does the resolution of title and treaty concerns look like, and what are the implications for the regional economy? So, for bridging and scaling up very quickly from conservation-based advocacy work and research to these much larger conversations about where they're going in the future. And, certainly the connection to climate resilience, Indigenous rights, and then broader conversations around what community and regional economic development look like are pulling these organizations in different directions and demanding higher levels of engagement and capacity from them as a result. And this quote really, I think, brings that home. Right, that they're not against everything, right? They want to see projects done right, and in that sense, there's a bigger issue here in terms of environmental impact assessment, particularly for provincial and national projects, which calls for a real rebalancing of how the public interest is defined in those projects, right? For the Enbridge pipeline, someone working in rural Newfoundland who was surveyed for the project said, well, 78% of Canadians are in favor of the project. So that rural Newfoundlander who said yes on that survey, their voice is counting just as much as someone locally in the region. Those processes are not taking adequate consideration into the role of place, into the local impacts and regional impacts of some of these projects. They're sort of passing them off with a broader national interest and bogus, overly inflated economic figures, for example. So, what are the implications for that? And then on the other side, if we're opposed to those types of industrial projects that we don't think are in the best interest of the region going into the future, for example, intensive mining and fracking operations in the sacred headwaters, then what are we for? And they're bridging into some really fascinating conversations, which opens up all new avenues for the resilience of these organizations as well as they transition over time. So all of this, I think that interconnectedness brings complexity. There are serious capacity concerns that, in terms of burnout, which I'm sure everyone on this call would be familiar with. And then a re-questioning of what are the responsibilities of senior governments? How much is being offloaded onto these organizations? How much can we do through sort of local and regional organizations versus, actually that's a senior government responsibility. This is a senior government service responsibility. Thanks, Brady. And that's it. So again, thanks very much for including me in the discussion today, and really enjoyed the other presentations and looking forward to hearing more.
Thanks very much, Sean. So we'll shift now to sort of a Q&A session for our final 10 minutes. And I think the way that we're doing things for this conference is to have people either use the raise hand function in Zoom if they have something to ask, or to type their question in the chat box. So I'll just pause for a moment to see if someone has a question. Okay, well, I will just go ahead and ask it then. So what I found really interesting about these presentations is, for me, what an interesting consistent theme was this talk about collaboration, and also talk about new collaborations that might not have been planned or might not have been used in the past. So my question about that is, looking in from the outside, I could see that as a very positive thing, that sort of being put under pressure and having to look into new areas for new collaborations is a good thing because it allows for these opportunities. But I also wonder if another narrative is, it's just sort of a survival mode. And sometimes it means you have to compromise what you want to do to be able to collaborate with new people and focus on new areas. So I would be interested from each of the panelists to hear, which of those they feel is more accurate, or whether it's a nice, healthy mix of the two things, sort of crisis and opportunity.
I would say healthy mix. If you asked me that maybe 2 years ago, I would be like panic. But it's also situational, I guess. So it depends on the time frame. Right now, it's just it needs to be done for better good. It works. Everybody's kind of leaning on each other for different aspects that they can't provide themselves. I know in our partnerships, I don't have the manpower to do the work. They don't have the organizational abilities to arrange the work to happen. And then you go to someone else, they have the funding that the other two don't have. So, you all lean on each other and you get the job done. So in that regard, it's a necessity, and it's for the better good. So.
Thanks, Darren. Lanna?
Yeah, this is really interesting, and this comes up all the time. I think because we are a long-standing, well-established organization, we're really careful with mission drift, and we're really careful with understanding what we have an expertise and capacity to take on. So while we may see something shiny over here, we sort of carefully watch to see if that is a trend. So for instance, right now we're seeing more and more entities interested in funding restoration. And so, but so we had to take pause and say, well, wait a minute, like we don't have the staff who know how to do restoration. This is not in our general programming. We don't, it's like we don't have the know-how and expertise. Do we want to go and be those experts in restoration? So we're really careful to not, because of the scale in which we operate, to not jump to those opportunities. Granted, there are times that we see windows and we're like, oh, well, we actually wanted to restore this landscape, so let's match that. But I think we also just have a larger overhead, and we just kind of like operate so that we need to be careful that we can't do it all. So we just need to be really good at a couple little things. And one of the ways that we collaborate is we try to channel or connect with the people who can do it. So to sort of be the bigger person and recognize that not every fund opportunity is for us. And so let's pass it off to the people who are going to do it better. And that can be their thing. So we're just trying to sort of strategize a little bit so that we are not setting ourselves up for failure if we start trying to do it all. And then getting really bad at it because you're doing everything.
I mean, I think there's a similar trade-off in academia. Sometimes I feel like we're constantly trying to balance saying yes to opportunities with saying no to opportunities. Sometimes that becomes more important. Sean.
We could say no? Yeah, sorry. No, great question. I think from a collaboration perspective, what's coming back in the data so far is how the crisis led to these strange allies talking to each other or thinking much more critically about how that continuum works together, research and advocacy on one side. So it brought different people together, right? If any one of those projects goes through, it transforms the region forever, right? So they're really high stakes projects. But what was sort of really interesting to also see coming out of the data was how that, and once you move away from that crisis perspective, it's led into, collaborations in different areas with different economic development organizations, for example, that are, facilitating some really interesting future envisioning for the region. I think, I really appreciate Lanna's comments there around knowing what your wheelhouse is, and then only having so much capacity. I think one of the challenges in this region is that some of these organizations, because of offloading or gaps from a restructuring perspective, that they're being forced into discussions or complexities that they're not prepared for. One of the strongest themes that came back was, we're having to sort of navigate these extraordinarily complex Indigenous relationships, right, with under significant amounts of uncertainty around the resolution of title and treaty, and what that means. The Indigenous nations themselves are maxed out from a capacity perspective, getting dozens and dozens and dozens of requests to do work in their traditional territories that they don't have the capacity to respond to. So that they're being forced out of their wheelhouse, so to speak, which is stretching their capacity. It's leading to some really interesting things and collaborations, but I think there was also a fairly healthy amount of concern that that we could be doing this poorly, right? We could actually be harming relationships that are really critical to the region. So some significant complexity there.
Thanks, everyone. Really, really interesting comments. I know we're just about out of time. I don't see any other hands or questions. Maybe Brady, I'll just defer to you for a second. I was thinking of asking a very, very short question for sort of one sentence answers, but I also don't have a good read on sort of like how exhausted everybody is. So if you wanted to make the executive decision, say this is enough, we can be done, I'd say that was fine.
Yeah, I think, we're a bit flexible here. Our last 15 minutes are sort of just a quick wrap up. So I'm okay if we take a couple extra minutes. I know if Sean or anyone has to leave, Lanna or Darren, feel free. But I had a quick follow-up question on that, thinking about sort of the notion of collaboration, and Devika, who did sort of the keynote plenary earlier with Dana from CFC, mentioned this notion around interconnectedness, but also intersectionality, and sort of thinking of the environmental movement outside of this silo of the environment, and that it really plays a role in social justice or environmental racism, or like these huge issues that we talk about. I mean, even like the COVID-19 crisis, like these things, she mentioned like pandemics will only ramp up with the environmental, with ecosystems collapsing and other things that are happening in the environmental sector. So is there a role, and I think maybe even for like Lanna working with NCC and Darren with IBEC, is there a role that some of these connections or collaborations with organizations outside of the environmental sector, you could say, would that sort of maybe support some of the initiatives you're doing, or could that sort of bring in other perspectives to your work, or what would you maybe say to that? Maybe I'll go to Lanna first.
Yeah, great question. We are definitely, as an organization, taking a very soulful deep dive into how we work with Indigenous peoples. And that's happening very deeply with our organization. So there's that. From a sort of, from our workforce standpoint, we're doing a lot of sort of workforce training around equality and trying to bring new faces to our work, recognizing that there is a major gap. If you look at compositions of our staff and compositions of our boards across the country, like, we've got work to do. I think this is traditionally an old white man initiative. And when you look at the hunters and anglers and people who've been on the land in terms of settler populations. But yeah, so we're doing a lot of soul searching as an organization and trying to find change where we can. But I think one of the ways that we're starting as Canadians is looking at reconciliation, taking it very seriously. Yeah.
What's the thoughts, maybe Darren, from yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have all the answers. If I did, I'd be selling myself pretty much for anybody who wants some information. But no, I mean, we're the smallest group of the three here, of course, in the major university and National Conservation Foundation. And we're just two people, if you're looking at it from a perspective of hands on the ground. So people outside of this organization, other groups, totally not even associated with the environment or not even associated with the area, if they take an interest in something we do, be it the podcast, be it restoration, be it tourism, any type of collaboration, I think, is vital. Even forestry. We have a very healthy relationship with Corner Brook Pulp and Paper. They donated to us. We've helped them with their areas for logging within the watershed. I mean, and there's a great give and take and communication there. You know, normally we would be out there scrapping ourselves to trees and saying, "You're not coming through here." So in that regard, yeah, I mean, if there's communication and if there's willingness there to help each other, and there's a benefit that works, but that doesn't really harm the environment, or if there is harm, it's minute, and there's a positive. For example, if you take down trees, you're replanting another 100,000 somewhere else. If that's there, then yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
Awesome. And I'll leave the last word up to Sean.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great question, Brady. And I mean, as we've seen in the research project that we're working on together, you know, part of that, you talked about COVID, right? And some of Catherine's work and others, the research on Sunshine Coast, for example, where the crisis has pushed organizations into space that they weren't previously contemplating. And which is another really interesting thing to think about from a sort of community foundations perspective, community assets perspective, just how quickly they were able to mobilize, how quickly they were able to respond to really targeted local or regional needs. But again, I think, you know, there's always those capacity and comfort level questions about how quickly we're doing this, whether we're doing it right. In our rush to respond, have we done proper engagement? You know, questions like that. So, I guess those big questions just heap buckets of complexity on organizations that often have a sort of a single sector mandate, and you know, and really stress that capacity, which again brings us back to, well, where should the responsibility for some of those bigger questions lie? You know, the provincial and federal governments are more active in not loading Indigenous relationships or relations, for example, on companies themselves or local actors, but stepping up and playing more of a role, and not just when someone starts blockading a rail line in Ontario, but years and years and years ago when the work should have started. So
awesome. Well, I think we'll end it there. And Garrett, thank you again for your role.
Brady, Garrett, I think Garrett, you had a question though, right? Or is that, do you?
Nope, not a question, just a comment.
Or a comment, yeah.
Just related to that discussion. So you can read it if you want, but not necessary.
Okay.
Yeah, you just put it in the chat there about a theme at Congress last week, a conference last week, was really looking at intersectionality and thinking about the intersection of health, environment, social justice, quality of life, decolonization, all of these huge topics, and that it's at the intersection of those that progress is made on any of them. And so I think that's a very key point as well to keep in mind for any of these sectors and people that are working in it and researchers as well. So great. Awesome. Okay, so we will, I want to thank all of you on the panel and Garrett as well for participating in our last panel of today. I know some of us on the call have been here since the beginning, so thank you so much for sticking with us and for getting through some really great material, hearing from some researchers and students and people in the field, and some getting some national perspectives and local perspectives, and hopefully having a good wrap-up conversation, which those who want to stay on the call, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm just going to run through a quick wrap up of some of the key themes that we found today. And I'd like everyone to sort of take a look. And if you have any, if you see one that you think, oh, this wasn't included or it's, should be expanded upon, then please feel free to add. Kelly, anything else before I go ahead and share my screen?
No, I don't think so. It'd be great. Yeah, if we, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be keeping track of themes through both days and then wrapping up tomorrow at the end of the day and including that in a report after the fact. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on what Brady has captured so far.
And also keep in mind, Amanda, who's on the call, is diligently taking notes for us, and we'll be sharing that as well later, so that these themes may change. This is sort of just a first glance at some of the things that I heard from today. And there was really 5 that came out. The first being around provocative and controversial conversations, sort of this urgency behind some of the things that we're talking about. And as Devika had mentioned in the beginning, we do a lot of talking about it, but we have to look at those actually doing the work on the ground and how we can shift our approaches to doing, in the environmental movement to really meeting that urgency of the climate crisis as it ramps up. Meeting people where they are at regarding environmental issues, I think was throughout the day, hearing about, local stories of people engaging with communities, starting with Devika in the beginning, talking about their approach now to, as opposed to going into initiatives with preconceived ideas or notions or how things are going to work, they really talk about their work as it meets with the community's priorities. Similarly, with some of the student research we heard, they're really working with organizations and communities to push their own agendas, as opposed to researchers or others coming into the community and doing that for them. I'm really focusing on a cultural shift in the environmental sector. And we heard this a couple times, I think, even thinking about this notion of intersectionality really talks to that sort of cultural shift and how we think about these complex, wicked problems, as you might say, and really in the environmental movement, focusing on small things like if you see your friend maybe who litters, like just saying, well, hey, you probably shouldn't litter, or like things that just become commonplace when you think about this, as opposed to sort of these rigid policy actions and policy change, really thinking at the local level as just people in the environment, and how we can shift that culture to recognizing things like COVID-19 and other crises that are happening as they relate to the environment, as opposed to sort of siloing the movement in its own sector. And then, of course, collaboration was a huge theme that we heard today all throughout. Different organizations that are working across the sector and intersectionally again, and how we can grow those networks and looking at organizations like Environment Funders Canada that we can connect with and meet others across the country, and even as Sean and Emma had mentioned about in their case study region, looking at how many organizations are working on this sort of thing. And similarly, I think those numbers may match up here in Atlantic Canada, but there isn't that necessarily that tight network or space for that to happen. So, hearing things like venue or voice, do we provide a venue for that, or do we take a stand on something and provide a voice? And I think for PhiLab, especially, that's an important conversation for us to have is, do we have that venue or voice, or both, and how we do that going forward in the sector. And then the last one really being integrity of place, and thinking about these place-based approaches, I think was a key discussion throughout. And I think it's really going to ramp up as we think about who gets funding and what's funded in the sector when it comes to sort of place-based initiatives, and thinking, there was a bit of talk about scaling up local activities. So thinking about what is happening at the local level, but then how that can translate to larger conversations, things like shifting the culture in the sector, and other larger initiatives outside of that place-based initiative or activity. So I do have, this is just sort of the list. I do have slides of some points I took, but I won't go through them all. I know that we've all been here all afternoon, so I will end it there. But we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. If there's any final remarks before we move on.
Just one that in Lanna's talk about donor stewardship and some of those kind of the real nuts and bolts of this, the growing the pie point about, so that was sort of, how NCC does it as an organization, but generally that came up at the beginning too. How do we get collaboration is one way, but how do we encourage more, and maybe trying to share the urgency of the situation somehow more. But I think that's an important point. We need to keep working at growing the pie somehow.
Hi, Doug. It looks nice and warm. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to share to that note, actually, I reached out to a colleague before I shared my panel, whose job is fundraising. And I just asked if she could tell me how NCC fared during the pandemic in terms of like donor giving. And she said that sort of we changed fiscals very early into the pandemic. So we like shifted and like reforecasted and everything. But she said that, so what we saw is that there was a decrease in donating. There was a decrease in donations in some ways, but there was an increase in others. And then there was also a lot of new donors that found NCC. So it's really interesting to see how people respond to a crisis like COVID-19. And I think that that the plenary said that maybe we missed the mark on calling COVID-19 a potential environmental crisis. I remember reading a couple of articles really early on about sort of making those connections about Mother Nature being like, go to your room, being like, so I think how people interpret things that are happening. Anyway, there was an increase in new donors to NCC. So it's interesting to see how that will respond, and as things like that start to happen.
Awesome. Any other last thoughts before we clue up?
Just the other one, I'm not sure if it was there. I think it's under your integrity of place point, Brady, but the power dynamic piece was really, I think, the local and that the challenge in that collaboration between, locally driven, locally grounded, but also connected to the larger national and international. I think that is under to some extent, again, under that collaboration point, but trying to balance that. So I think Lanna spoke to that, and Sean, you spoke about international connections, and but what people really, it has to be grounded in the local, but connected beyond. That point came out, which I think pretty strongly as well.